Hello again. My name is Cole Blair. I'm the lead biologist for Wildlife Preservation Canada's Native Pollinator Initiative. I'm continuing a series based on our work that we do with bumblebees, including community science, how you can get involved in either participating or running a program. Um, and this section specifically pertains to how to initiate and run a bumblebee community science program. So we've established some background information on bees, what they are and what makes them bees, the colony cycle of bees, diversity of bees, the threats to bees and what we do with them, why we care so much, and all about Bumblebee Watch. But now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what actually a community science program entails. First and foremost, I want to clarify that these are kind of broader outlines. This isn't a step-by-step guide, and the program structure can vary depending on the needs of the host. So in this installation of the information sessions, this is specifically in the context of starting your own Bumblebee Community Science program. And again, with WPC assistance, we can vary the structure depending on the needs of you as the host organization. So before we get into anything in terms of initiation, we want to determine your goals. Are you looking to monitor bumblebees long term, or are you just looking to get a species list for your property? Why do you like, are you interested in recruiting volunteers more broadly? Like, are you a park? Um, are you looking to gain inferences on like different aspects of your property? Are some parts of your property suitable for bees? What kind of data do you want out of this, and what are you going to use it for? These are all great questions to determine before we actually jump into um, establishing a program. And again, the answers to these might change over time, and they will also help you guide later questions. One of them being like how to define your sites. For example, if you're looking to just get a species list for your property, you might not need a ton of thought into how you um, establish and define your sites. They might just be one area where volunteers can come and free roam. But if you're looking to monitor bumblebees long term, you might separate sites or even group them into site sets based on shared characteristics and shared habitat traits. So again, all of these goals are going to help inform the later questions that we're going to be asking as we initiate as we think about initiating a Bumblebee community science program. Some more important questions to consider. Think about your own limitations as an organization with regards to funding and personnel availability, uh, and again, how you want these surveys to be structured. So, where are you going to be keeping equipment and supplies? Are they going to be available to volunteers, or are you going to be um, alongside volunteers during surveys? Are they going to be independent surveys where volunteers need to come in and check out um, equipment for the surveys and come back and return them? Or are they going to be group efforts where your staff go out with a group of volunteers and conduct it together? And how much area do you have for surveying? And this will help, again, help you decide how many sites would be possible and what those sites might look like. Very important consideration here is, do you need permits? Um, so by and large, when we're thinking about a community science program, what's really needed is a property to host the program on. However, you can also take this information if you don't have a property, if you're not looking to establish a um, like a independent community science program, you're looking for something else, like maybe you want to have group bee walks with people, but you don't have a site for it. You don't have your own property, so you can't really have like an established program or some other variation of that where you still want to include and engage your local communities in Bumblebee community science, but you don't have the areas needed for an established program. You can still use the information that I'm giving to you and again, tweak it to your specific needs. But with regards to permits, if it's located on a private property like a provincial or national park, a conservation area, um, permits might be needed. Definitely would be needed for a park or a conservation area. If it's your own private property, that might not be as much of a consideration. But again, permits specifically for volunteers to be allowed to access your location, your property, and for volunteers to potentially handle bees on your property. So just some things to consider. And when we're thinking about a community science program, I'll start this next little part by just what to expect out of it. So we've gone over some of the goals and objectives, and those goals and objectives are going to determine how you develop your protocol and select your sites. So we'll go over into some more detail, the actual survey protocols and the different variations of that and how we can tweak them. We can also go over nuances in the site selection methods, but also to expect a safety plan. Um, do you need waivers for your volunteers? It's always a good idea to give to them emergency contacts for different situations, potentially. Identify the hazards that might be present. Um, you know, Making sure that um, the that participation in your program is safe for your volunteers um, at any given point. So a safety plan, what equipment and materials you might need would need to be purchased depending on what survey method you opt for. Um, Advertising the program is a good idea, especially if it's a new program. So this would help with volunteer recruitment and a training workshop in which the host, alongside WPC, depending on your location, if it's the first year of your program, to train those volunteers on how to conduct their own Bumblebee surveys. Setting up a volunteer sign up to help manage your survey effort and your volunteers. And then also at the end of it all, some volunteer feedback and appreciation packages are very nice. So the feedback is really useful for helping to identify what aspects of your program went really well, what might have been not so good, and how you can improve for the next year. And this all ties into a program evaluation that we'll help you with and a first year reflection. But again, along every single step of the way, the program structure is flexible. Um, Basically, that whole outline that I gave is laid out in fine detail in our community science manual. So if you're interested in exploring community science further as a host, um, you can reach out and we can provide this to you. And it'll basically outline monthly tasks that need to be done in order to have a successful program. And of course, we help you with all of this. Also sections on equipment that you might need, how we select sites, safety plan and survey protocol development. Basically, everything that I'll be talking about right now is going to be laid out in text, in detail in this document. And I'll start with survey protocol. So we imagine ourselves as a Bumblebee community science volunteer, and we're thinking about how these surveys are going to run. So as a host, it's up to you to decide what is working best for you, what might work best for you, and we can help you decide that. So survey considerations like what method of survey, and I'll get into this more in detail in a little bit, but basically, do you want to capture bees or just photograph bees? Where or what sites you want to define on your property, when you want the program to run. So bumblebees are emerging in the early spring. So you could imagine that would be like late April, early May, depending on where you are, and they're active until the early fall. So um, when you want your program to run would be dependent on things like what flowers are available on your sites and when. When it comes to timing, we recommend late June to mid-September because this is when worker bees will be more active and it'll make bees easier to find than just relying on trying to locate queens in the spring. So again, that late June to mid-September period um, is what we do in our existing programs. And again, timing for the surveys. Our time frames range from as short as 30 minutes to as long as 2 hours. So um, it's up to you to decide what survey timing is best. And this could be informed by things like how much disturbance are you okay with on your site and where, and also um, what kind of survey method or program structure you're opting for. Also, what data do you want to be recorded? So broadly, the information that we record in our programs, um, we'll start with some environmental conditions like weather, temperature, and some broad weather variables, and this can help us determine why some surveys were more effective than others or successful than others. So, um, there's like if it's raining or if it's too hot for bees, you can identify that through the weather data that was recorded for the survey. Floral resources can also be recorded specifically with the bees that were captured on flowers or recorded on flowers. And that'll help you get a sense of what flowers are available at your different sites, um, perhaps in what abundance. And then this can help you in your evaluation phase decide what sites are performing well, what we can do possibly to improve site performance, or what sites should remain on the site list or possibly be replaced or removed. Bee specific information um, might involve potential species ID, a tentative species ID, also what site you're surveying at, the time of survey. For individual bees, you might record the time of the capture to help you keep track of the individual bees in your survey collection, and the floral resource that the bee was observed on. So again, um, depending on what you choose, it could be a combination of these different things that I've discussed here. Um, and again, depending on the conditions of your property and of your sites, and your own workload, your own staff capacity, we can um, tweak the time frames in terms of season and survey time to your needs. So when we're thinking of surveys, really, when we're doing Bumblebee surveys, even in community science, the name of the game is really just to find flowers at your site and wait for bees. So I mentioned the seasonal timing of your program might vary. It might be early spring, it might be summer. These are just some flowers of interest to look out for on your property, depending on where you are. Again, this is more specific to South Central Ontario. Um, However, there might be some other flowers or these same flowers represented on your property elsewhere in the country. Um, Willows are going to be one of the first flowers to start blooming in the early spring, followed by dandelions and such. Um, Apples into May and autumn olive closer into late May and into June. You'll note that some of these flowers aren't native. Like autumn olive is not native. The dandelions are not native. Um, the bees aren't picky. Really, when we're thinking about site selection with regards to our community science programs, you'll just want to make sure that there are um, adequate bumblebee resources. Because if there's no flowers around for bumblebees to come forage from, your odds of locating bumblebees are going to be very, very slim. Similarly, in the summertime, which is again where we um, advise that programs run, again, because workers are going to be more abundant, making bumblebees more readily found. Also, later in the summer, you'll have a larger diversity and potentially abundance of flowers depending on where you are. The great thing about these ones too is that they're pretty low growing and they're often associated with disturbance. Like even in the photograph of the knapweed here, it's growing along a trail. So if your sites are restricted to trails on your property, still likely to have some of these flowers represented on your site, um, like knapweed should be out right now. It's in August. Raspberries a little bit earlier. Goldenrod starting to bloom here. We had vetches and clovers throughout. Um, but again, some of these are going to be native, some of them aren't. Um, But these late summer flowers I really find are really easy to work um, with community science because they're pretty pervasive. They can be found in pretty good abundance, and they are associated with disturbance, which makes um, trails a good place to have your sites and a good place to have some flowers to find bees. And that would help you reduce disturbance to the rest of your property too, if that is a concern of yours as a host. Okay, with that in mind, we'll get into the actual how-to survey. So now we're going to place ourselves in the seat of the volunteer. So we've been trained, we've arrived at the property, and we've got our equipment, and we've found our way over to our site that we chose to survey. So once we're at our site and we've started our survey, as I mentioned before, the name of the game is to find flowers and wait for bees. So I might wander to different flower patches, or if it's a trail, I might just wander the trail and go from flower patch to flower patch and wait around for a few minutes and see if any bees come by. Once a bee does come by, if we're opting for the full 9 yards, where we're capturing bees um, and holding on to them until the end of the survey for identification, then I'll have a net and some other equipment that I'll go through in a little bit. But if we're catching bees, this is how I would do so. So we're going to start with a video on the right panel here, and this um, surveyor is going to use their net to sweep a bee out of these taller flowering bushes. So we see bees in the net bag, and at this point, while she's sweeping, she's going to flip once and then flip over again. So the top of the net bag where the bee is now over the rim of the net, and this is going to help prevent the bee from escaping out from the underside of the net. This is really great method for taller flowers, or if people have mobility issues, they might not be so keen on bending down to get bees from the ground. Um, so this is a great way to do that. However, if flowers are just low growing or on the ground, you can simply plop your net over the bee. Regardless of how you do this, once you've got your bee in your net, we're going to want to then transfer it into a vial. So in this video here, this demonstrator has captured a bee, and now she's got a bee in the top of the net bag, and you see she's pinched off a part of the net, and this will help keep the bee from escaping down the outside of the net, or the underside of the net. After this, we take a vial. So we've got our bee at the top of the net bag. We hold it up. Once we catch the bee, we hold the net bag up because the bee's instinct is going to be to fly up and get away. But of course, they're in a net. So the bee flies up to the top of the net. We can then section off that net, that part of the net, to prevent the bee from climbing back down and escaping from the bottom of the net. At that point, I can take a vial, as we see in the diagrams here and in the video. I can remove the lid and feed the vial through my hands and pull the net tension, pull tension through the nets over the vial and trap the bee in that vial. And then I can feed my vial lid back up there, slide it over the top of the vial, and snap it closed. And we want to be careful to apply the pressure on the vial lid to close the lid on the outside, like the edges of the vial, instead of like pressing directly on the center of the vial, because as I've learned recently, it is possible to be stung through the air holes of the vial. So be careful of where your bee is in your net at all times, especially when you're vialing, because again, you're reaching your hand under a net where there is an insect that can sting you. So be very, very careful of where the bee is when you're transferring your bee from net to vial, and be careful when you're placing the vial lid on the vial that you apply pressure from the sides, and then also be careful not to get her legs caught as well. So again, we've got a bee from a flower. We've lifted the net bag up, sectioned off that top part of the net, and fed our vial through the net to capture that bee and secure it in the vial. And now we can record some information on the label that is placed on the vial. So that piece of tape there is going to serve as our label. And some of the information that we have here in the photograph include Um, some necessary things, but some things that are just added details. The Q there represents queen, so that's the cast of the bee. 1427 is simply a time. Um, BIMAC is a shorthand of the species. So um, if you're surveying as a volunteer and you want to try species ID right off the top, um, you can try and label it as a species. But really, what's best to record, or the minimum that you'd want to record, is simply the time, because this will help you keep track of what species corresponds, what would be in your vial corresponds to the data points on a volunteer's data sheet. And then also we see ground ivy. That is the flower that the bee was captured on. And you could also add that to a volunteer data sheet as well. So um, the bare minimum would just be some sort of indication of the individual bee itself, ideally in the form of a time. You could also create your own alphanumeric code to help you keep track of things. And this is mostly to organize your camera reel at the end of a survey, because we will be photographing our bumblebees at the end of a survey. And also, if it was captured foraging from a flower, you can try to ID that flower, and that will help um, on the host's end of things identify what flower species at that site was associated with bees, and what is present at these sites at different parts of the year. Um, so at this point, we've been going through our surveys, we've captured some bees, and now um, we've got our bee in our vial now, and now it's time to cool the bee down. So again, if we're going for the traditional survey method, where we are capturing bees and keeping them temporarily, once we've got a bee in a vial, we'll want to cool it down, um, ideally through the use of these little cooler bags where we have a little ice pack in there. This is not just to keep the bee from overheating, but it is also in the interest of um, slowing the bee down for adequate ID pictures. So we imagine now this person sitting in the grass has completed a survey. They're trying to ID their bees. They've got an ID book here. The bee is nice and calm. It's been cooled down, allowing for the different color patterns to be very clearly seen. And then they can compare that to the diagrams on either the Bumblebee ID card or in some specialized ID textbook. Um, but in this other video here, we see um, some of the bees are more active than others. So this first bee that's picked up is still quite active. It might need to be chilled for a little bit more, but these other bees are quite lethargic. They're very sleepy. These ones would be great for IDing. So you can take these bees and capture some very clear photographs, and you can also, because they're so slow and so sleepy, you can observe and note all those different color patterns on the head, thorax, and abdomen, and compare them to the ID resources. It'd be quite hard to do that if the bee was bouncing off the inside of the vials, and it would make ID photographs for Bumblebee Watch a little bit harder too. Um, the next part of our survey, so again, we've gone out, we've captured bees, we've labeled the vials, we've cooled them down, we've finished our survey, and we've photographed them all. So um, what we have here is an example of a data sheet that we adapt for our different community science programs, but again, can be tweaked to your needs. So this top part is some preliminary information regarding where you are and when, who you are, some different weather variables. So volunteers might do this before they go out and actually do the survey. And then at the end of the survey, they'll fill out the different bee species, if it was observed on a flower. And then they also have this column here referencing a photo number. And this is specific to the individual surveyor. So um, I'd mentioned I had mentioned labeling the vial labels with certain unique identifiers like a time or an alphanumeric code. Um, but another way that volunteers can help organize and manage their camera reels with all the bees that they've captured is by writing down what photo numbers are associated with that individual bee, And then when it comes to upload those to Bumblebee Watch, they can just go into their camera reels and find those photos and know that that is for that specific bee. So a good idea here when we're doing this in the field, if you imagine I've got a dozen bees, I could take my first bee and photograph the front of the vial and then photograph different angles of the bee. So I know that uh, those photos go with that specific bee. If I captured a bee at 11:19, I can photograph the vial label. It'll say 11:19, and then the next photos after that, I'll know go with that bee that was captured at 11:19. And then I could do the same with um, all the other bees, where I start with a photograph of the label on the vial, and then I photograph the different angles of the bee. So when volunteers are out in the field, they'll complete this data sheet in its entirety, except for this final column here that says BBW record. That's Bumblebee Watch record. So the general order of survey and Bumblebee Watch contribution goes survey, um, bee photography, then you'd release your bee. And then you would upload the photos to Bumblebee Watch. And then after you've done that, you would find your Bumblebee Watch records for your individual bees that you captured during that survey and transcribe them back onto the volunteer data sheet. And at that point, the data sheet is complete and the volunteer can submit that back to the hosts. We do this through either just scans or photocopies, and how you use the data and how you manage the data sheets would be entirely up to you as the host. I'm just using this as an example because this is what we do in our own programs. But again, this can be dependent on what you need and what you're using it for. And I'll go through in greater detail later on how to submit to Bumblebee Watch. Now, we've been talking about surveying in the context of like a full survey involving nets and vials where we capture bees and temporarily hold on to them and then release them at the end of the survey. Depending on your needs, either by way of financial limitations like funding limitations, equipment limitations, um, permit restrictions. So if, for example, you don't have the funds to purchase nets and vials, cooler bags and ice packs, or you don't have a place to have storage, like an equipment bin accessible for volunteers to come and get equipment for surveys, or for example, if your permit does not allow you to handle bumblebees or capture bumblebees on that property, you can also opt for the method to avoid capture altogether and just rely on photography. I'd mentioned cooling bees as being helpful for photography and ID, but it's not necessary. And instead of netting under these circumstances, again, if funding is limited or if permits are restrictive, you can instead have volunteers simply photograph bees on flowers. This is a little bit more difficult. Um, you can imagine volunteers chasing the same bee from flower to flower, like trying to get a good opportunity for it to slow down long enough to get a couple decent videos or decent photographs. But there are ways around this, and there are still ways like an expert can still um, confidently ID species from photographs like that for the most part. So um, it is still possible to get the same information from simply photographing rather than netting and vialing bees. But it is recommended that programs include capturing and vialing bees just for confidence. Um, with that in mind, I want to go over some equipment and materials. The ones in asterisks are specific to the netting and vialing method. So again, you would need nets, vials, ice packs, and cooler bags, as we've discussed in our examples. However, if we're going purely for photography instead of collecting and releasing, then you wouldn't need to worry about these aspects of the equipment and materials. Safety vests are great to have for volunteers, um, especially if you're surveying nearby to a road or on a road, or where there's other work being done, or simply just to help make the volunteers feel more at ease, knowing that people will look at them and identify that they are working, they're doing something. safety vests are a good idea. A storage bench, and this is where you can keep data sheets and site maps, ID cards, um, capture materials and equipment like nets and vials, a clipboard with writing utensils to help volunteers um, manage program documents and find their way around and also fill in their data sheets. Cameras, the volunteers bring. You don't really have to worry about this one because everybody's got cell phones with very, very detailed cameras. And that's all I've ever used in my experience with photographing bumblebees. So a professional camera, a dedicated camera is not really necessary, but it is optional for um, those out there um, really that really want the full photography experience with bumblebees. However, again, some of these materials aren't necessary um, and can be opted out depending on your survey method. Cost of this associated, if you were to go for capture and temporary collection, so for nets, vials, ice packs, and cooler bags, um, startup for all that equipment would roughly be about $1,000 to get enough nets, um, vials, especially would be the bulk of that. Nets and vials being the bulk of that. Ice packs and cooler bags you could just get from places like Dollar M or Canadian Tire. With that in mind, though, equipment and material selection out of the way, I want to move into site selection. I've touched on this briefly, but we can kind of think about this as like a hierarchy of needs when it comes to our site selection. So at the very bottom of that hierarchy, the most important consideration when it comes to site selection is ensuring that locations are easily accessible and where access is permitted, um, which might have considerations for a potential permit. So if a permit is restricting access to certain parts of the location, um, you would need to incorporate that. But if all is okay and you're totally free to create your own sites, again, the most important part is going to be to have locations that are easily accessible to your volunteers. Um, again, volunteers will be can be ranging from families, including kids, to um, older folks that might have mobility issues. So again, making sure that your sites are accessible to everybody. And we want to choose areas that support bumblebee activity. So where wildflowers are plentiful, and this is going to be dependent on the time of season. And you're going to also want to try, depending on how much area you have, to include a variety of habitats if you can. So if you've got part of your property that is um, meadowy with a lot of low-growing wildflowers, but then you've got another part of your property where it's adjacent to a forest that also has some good wildflowers at the forest edge. It's good to have both of those habitat types or more habitat types as well if you've got more habitat types on your property to be included in your sites. Also, consider as the host organization or the property owner whether you want people to stay on trail or not. So trails can be a good way to identify sites and are also a good way to mitigate disturbance to other parts of your property. And again, might be important with permits. So a permit might require that volunteers stay on marked trails. But if it's your own property and you've got total freedom to discern this for yourself, you can still make the decision um, based on what you are comfortable with when it comes to disturbance to your property. Um, and again, depending on how many sites you select or establish, um, making sure that those sites are represented in the survey effort from your volunteers is also important to identify um, community differences and bumblebee differences between sites and also the um, survey success between sites. So this is some more details on site selection. I've mentioned site sets before. This is something that we do in the context of our existing program at Pinery. So at Pinery, we were lucky enough to have a pretty big area with a very, very broad um, variety of habitat types. So we can group sites together that are nearby or are different or similar in their habitat types, in their habitat sets, or habitat characteristics. Um, and then the volunteers can survey parts or the entirety of that site set on a given day. Um, Trail loops I mentioned. So in a park, for example, there might be existing trails that are just open broadly to park visitors. Um, Very easy to make those into a site where volunteers could just survey along the trail, preferably with a time survey. Um, a trail loop is quite flexible in terms of area of your property. So whether or not you've got a ton of area or a small amount of area, trail loops can be implemented quite easily. Um, Site lists, similar to site sets, except they're not groups together, they're just different sites. Again, very good if you've got a decent amount of area, but not enough area where you would see um, like groupings based on habitat type, like we see in the Pioneer example where we group them by set. So if you've got a ton of area and you're looking for long-term bumblebee monitoring, site sets might be the way to go. They might be the best for you. Site lists would be similar, um, but a trail loop can either be implemented in a context where you have an abundance of area or in a context where you have limited area. Free roam, not ideal if you're looking to get long-term bumblebee monitoring data, but it's totally okay if you're just looking for a species inventory or if you've got um, limited areas that you can survey on your property. So if your property is small or you're restricted by permit to stay within a certain area, you can always just have free roam sites where um, a small open area is available for volunteers to wander freely and observe bees. Again, all of this is quite flexible. These suggestions and prompts are just to kind of prime our brainstorming when it comes to your specific desires and your specific hosting location. So now that we've gone over kind of the survey how to and what the program entails, I want to jump back into how to implement the program. Um, I want to start with training. So again, we're here training trainers, but at some point the trainers will be training volunteers. And if it's for a established program, this will be done through a training workshop. Um, Volunteers will sign up for this workshop on a online platform or however you want to advertise it. Um, we use Sign Up Genius or similar programs. Um, and then they would come, be trained on the volunteer duties and the survey methods. And then throughout the course of the season, they might sign up for um, independent Bumblebee surveys through another sign up that you provide to them. And when we're running a program, this is when the program itself starts to become a little bit more self-sufficient. So volunteers are signing up at their own leisure when they're able to. And as coordinators of these volunteers, you would just need to make sure that there aren't an overabundance of survey teams going out on any given day. So making sure that the equipment that is available um, is not fewer than the people that are going out and surveying, and ensuring that um, people are checking in or checking out with you just to ensure safety, or things like coordinating certain sites. So if you find that there are certain sites that need to be surveyed that just haven't been surveyed, you can go into registrations for your surveys and see what volunteers are planning on surveying in the coming days, and then you can coordinate with them, possibly surveying another site instead to get some inferences on locations that hadn't been surveyed yet that year. So, um, pretty some supervision required when it comes to coordinating our volunteers, but after a training workshop, um, it'll be up to them to sign up for surveys and come back and conduct those surveys. Now, throughout the survey season, throughout the community science program, um, again, even before this, you'll want to think about promoting your training workshop and advertising that. And then after the workshop is concluded and your volunteers begin signing up for surveys, it's a good idea to keep them up to date on the program's progress, and to give them reminders throughout the course of the survey season. And you can do this through emails, um, social media, traditional media, but again, advertising your program beforehand, and then also keeping volunteers in the loop during your program is very important for the volunteer experience and also recruiting and retaining volunteers. At the wrap up of the program, especially on the first year, um, we give some examples of some of these things too, but it's always a good idea to send out some volunteer feedback surveys again to get some inferences from your volunteers on what they enjoyed of your workshop and of your survey program, what they might not have enjoyed as much, and how you can improve uh, to make it more enjoyable for volunteers. I'd mentioned volunteer appreciation. So we can there can be examples and inspirations from this that we can discuss with you. For first year specifically, important to have a report sent to your volunteers and us. So a yearly report to your volunteers is always a good idea. A report to us is also important, specifically for the first year of the program. And this will accompany a reflection meeting where um, we can assess how the program performed, um, how things went on your end as the host and on the volunteer side of things, and then implement whatever changes that might be necessary to improve for next year. So this section has been pretty dense. I want to wrap up by just summarizing what WPC is offering through these Bumblebee community science platforms or programs, sorry. So before anything is even established, we provide the training, the educational materials, and the community science manual to you as the host. We would help you, depending on your location, run your first year's training workshop, after which subsequent years will be handled by the host independently, though we can still offer assistance wherever needed. Um, we'll set up a Bumblebee Watch project for you, for your volunteers to submit their observations. And this will help us ensure that we at WPC on our team can find all of your volunteer submissions rather than having them go in the Bumblebee Watch um, general Bumblebee Watch folder. It'll go in a specific folder where we can go in and check for new observations and verify them ourselves. We'll also give you help with advertising for your program and ways to do that and materials to draw inspiration from and incorporate. And as I mentioned, we'll be the ones verifying your volunteers' submissions to Bumblebee Watch. So ensuring that everything that they collect and submit is being verified in a timely manner. And then wrapping everything up with reflection and protocol evaluation with you. So a lot of stuff to unpack here. However, again, I want to reiterate that everything that I've mentioned now is completely transformable and can be changed depending on the needs of you as the host, the needs of your property, the needs of whatever permits that are applicable, um, and whatever else. And we also help with all of these other aspects throughout the program and after the program. So, again, just to wrap up, what would all be entailed with a Bumblebee Community Science program, partnered with Wildlife Preservation Canada using bumblebeewatch.org to consolidate all of our data.